Exandria is the setting created by Matt Mercer and is used for the basis for the web series Critical Role, of which he is the game master. For the last decade, D&D has been slowly making a comeback to be at the cool place it is today. That 70s show had Alice Cooper playing D&D in an end title sequence, and certainly more recently Stranger Things has had an impact. From some that I met that were new to gaming, it was Stranger Things that sparked their initial interest, and then they found Critical Role and others on YouTube when they went looking for more information. The internet is D&D's friend right now. For the most part, Critical Role is on a weekly schedule, and with the work involved in creating stories for a weekly game, I have to admit I was very surprised when Matt Mercer created a new setting for their game. I am sure he's been thinking about it for a long time, and working on it as time went on, but still, it's a big job, and that is on top of the story and preparation required to run the games. The setting is high fantasy, and anyone familiar with the style of setting like Forgotten Realms or Pathfinders won't be lost in Tal'Dorei. I think he hit a really nice balance. It's not different for different's sake. If something worked, then it doesn't seem like he tried to reinvent that wheel. Instead, concentrating on the places, gods, people and customs, those things that bring the setting alive. Now it is my understanding it started as a home game in Pathfinder, and then moved to streaming on Twitch through Geek and Sundry, and a change to D&D 5e rules. Because of this, there are going to be a couple of discrepancies along the way. The biggest is possibly the inclusion of Sarenrae, the deity that Pike follows, and is a holdover from the group's Pathfinder games. Personally, I think it's cool to mix and match settings. I use Pathfinder adventure paths in Forgotten Realms, mixing all sorts of stuff. The rule of cool. But you won't find Sarenrae in the campaign setting book. Within this nice hard-covered book is the base information of the setting. It is certainly an enjoyable read if you're a fan of the show, and it gives a lot of information. I am not well versed in the web series enough to know if there is a lot of extra information not found in the series, but it certainly collects all the relevant information in an easy to find and read format, which is a very good thing. The opening message is a nice one to the fans and to the people who bought the book, and he strengthens the idea that this book is there for people to make their own games in Tal'Dorei, so it's not just an info guide, but a reference one for your own stories in the setting. The first section is the mythological foundation of the land, creation, the ages, the calamity. It moves from the mythological to more of a historical telling, covering some of what is known about the calamity. The rise of cultures and the wars that resulted are all covered here. Those who follow the show will recognise a couple of names in this section, the Cinder King and the Chroma Conclave. Next is a fun section for GMs, as it covers how to run a campaign in Tal'Dorei. It's not many pages, but it's got very good tips that translate well into any game. I have to admit I never pay much attention to the gods in games, and for all the years I have played, I still don't know most of the gods in the various games that I do play. Having said that, I did enjoy the deity section of the book. This is possibly a first for me. I think in part it was because each deity is handed out in more bite-sized portions. All the most important information is covered, but it doesn't become a lecture. An image of each of the god symbols is also included, which is a nice touch. I found the betrayer gods the most interesting. The races of Tal'Dorei follows next, and this is possibly the most standard part of the book. And that's not bad in any way, and is very functional, which is what you really want for these kind of sections. This is very much the not reinventing the wheel part of the book. The art for the various races is quite nice, and doing it in this way allows easier access to people familiar with 5e. But another very important point is that 5e licenses does not allow character creation rules to be included, not without special permission or a separate license. Wizards wants to sell its player's guide. With that in mind, big changes to the race's stat blocks and abilities might have caused confusion. The changes, therefore, if there are any, are in the lore, and that's a fine place to have them. Otherwise, an elf is an elf, a dwarf is a dwarf, and so on. The factions and societies is a very cool section. These give a decent amount of information about some of the movers and shakers in the setting. Here you will find the Arcana Pansophical, a kind of magic guild, as well as the Ashari and the Brawlers League, the Chamber of Whitestone, and this is the home of Percival Frederickstein von Musil-Klosowski de Rollo III, a sophist of native ingenuity. And I've probably butchered that terribly. His backstory was resolved on the show. The Claret Orders is a very interesting magic group and just rife with potential for story and intrigue with your players. And as a GM, I love that there is room for surprises with that faction. The Council of Tal'Dorei is an expected inclusion, and they are possibly the most functional and mundane of the groups in this section. But when you look at it, they kinda have to be. That doesn't mean that they are boring, however. For not being boring, however, is my favourite of the groups in this book, the Clasp. In essence, they are a thieves' guild, but they are a good one. There are layers to it that is often lacking from groups like this. While the guild's motivations at first glance seem somewhat typical, if you think about the wording, there is actually a lot of room to play with them. They might also support some things the GM might not at first consider. Lots of fun can be had with this group. Craghammer is a dwarven city. Very cool name and nice to have a dwarven city included. The Golden Grin is included as well, with a short write-up and a mention of a couple of its members. From memory, there were more than 2 important people involved with them, so some might be a little disappointed that not more were included. The Myriad, a large crime ring, is a nice addition too. It's these sort of things that can give GM ideas and breathing room for a story. The Remnants, a secret cult, and like the crime rings, these cults can make excellent villains. They can pull strings behind the scenes and allow a GM to get out of some plot holes that they might have dug for themselves. The last one in this section is the Wardens of Singorn, the Elves. Now, one that I did expect to see and did not was the Slayer's Take. They were not huge in the overall scope of the world, but they were involved in a couple of storylines and were more involved than, say, the Brawlers League, and I am surprised not to see them included. Chapter 2 starts with a calendar, and there is a note saying most GMs don't step outside standard time for days and weeks, but Tal'Dorei does operate on a different time, and it is included here for anyone wishing to use it. Now we get into the actual geography of the setting. In some ways, this is the most important part of the book, the actual geography. The land and its places are such an important part of the setting, it's what fills the void. But that's not the full story, and an argument could be made that the peoples and races are just as important. Starting with the Lucidian coast, it discusses the region and has a couple of adventure seeds for each one. I personally would rather the 2 paragraphs for each of these sections be used for more information about the region. The Star Wars guides do the same thing. However, as I am sure some people do find them useful, then it's totally fine. It's just a personal preference. I didn't recognise any of the places, but I'm sure that other fans will. Next is the Alabaster Sierras. Here I do know one of its places. Whitestone. This section covers several places in small detail. Areas like the Shearing Channel, the Salted Bluffs, Parchwood Timberlands, and Moran River Run. But it is Whitestone where the meat of this section is. There is some basic information, a very pretty map, as well as information about the effects of the Briarwoods, Whitestone as in the rock, its government, crime, and a host of landmarks. Places like the Castle, Ziggurat, Suntree, Greyfield, and the Illusionary Barrier. It's a good section overall. The Dividing Plains comes next, and is one of the larger geography sections. It includes the Bramblewood, which is an interesting place, Foromir Basin, Ironside Ridge, Ivyheart Thicket, Kaimol, the ruins of Thorhill, the Shade Barrow, Taurian Forest, Thurstfang, Wildwood Byway, and of course, Western. The city has the largest part of this section and discusses its government, crime, the revolution, and a couple of landmarks like the Black King and the Survivor's Legacy. The Cliffkeep Mountains features Emberhold, Fort Daxio, Gat's Shadow, the Grey Valley, Joran Village, and Craghammer. The Dwarven City is the focus of this section and is a large section with more than 12 locations. The Stormcrest Mountains is a small section, but has an important place in history. The Ashen Gorge was Thordak's home, but it covers a couple of other locations as well. Most of what comes out of this section is the home of some of the lizardmen, kobolds, and orcs, though there is one town mentioned, Bronbog, as well as a drow city. The Riffin Mist Peninsula has a lot of potential, partly as it is a location that has some jungle, and many areas in fantasy tend to be woodland a great deal. There are some towns like Bryoden, the Oroyan tribes, which seem to be somewhat nomadic, and there is a huge hobgoblin city of 47,000 beasties. There is also a mix of locations like the Storm Point Mountains and the Riffin Fist jungle. If you want elves, then the Verdant Expanse is the place for you, home to Singorn and all that elvish prejudice. As is expected, the elvish city dominates the section, but places like the Myaskar and Tormor Falls are mentioned. The Blade Shimmer Shoreline, wow, is a big section. It features a lot of places like Dagger Bay Mountains, Emerald Outpost, Scar of the Cinder King, but it is Amon that stands tallest in these pages. It has a cool map and all the standard information about the city. Its districts get a decent amount of information as well as landmarks. Fans of Gilmore's Glorious Goods will be happy to know that he gets a good amount of text. To end the chapter is the distant regions of Exandria. Places like the Shattered Teeth and Wildmount get a mention. Chapter 3 is Crunch. the player options. Now it has to be said, as I have seen some criticism about compatibility, so let's deal with this now. If you are playing a regular 5e game, you need to check with your GM what is allowed, but really that should kind of happen normally, I think. If you are playing in DDAL, then these will not be compatible and will not be allowed. However, having said that, not everything has to be DDAL compatible to begin with, so I am not fully sure how that was a criticism. I do have a couple of criticisms though, which I will list at the end. As player options, you get the Blood Domain for clerics, Path of the Juggernaut for barbarians, Runechild for sorcerers, and Way of the Cobalt Soul for monks. That sounds cool. There are some new backgrounds. Class Member, that's fun. The Lyceum Student, Ashari, Recovered Cultist, just don't fall off the wagon, Fate Touched, a handful of new feats like Gambler, Cruel, Spell Driver, Rapid Drinker, and Flash Recall, amongst others. There are some magic items which cover largely staffs and armour and weapons. A short section for the GM on some of the optional rules they use in the show. Alternative Resurrection rule is probably the most interesting from a certain point of view. Chapter 4 is Allies and Enemies. The first few pages cover some lore for a few of the monsters in the game, Driders, Gnolls, Fae, Giantkin, Goblins and Orcs, and so on. Now overall the book is excellent. A nice hardcover, the art is beautiful, it's well written and easy to read, but I wish it just had a little bit more crunch. Now I know all my regular players at this moment are going, wait, what did we just hear? Did we hear that right? Did our story GM actually say he wanted more crunch? Has Grog given up drinking? But yes, I wanted a little more crunch. All the lore is awesome. It really is, and it does set the framework on where to set your game. The magic items are cool, and that part is also okay. It's still 5e, so many of their items may be in the Dungeon Master's Guide. But what it is lacking is NPCs. There are no stats for any of Vox Machina. No major NPCs are featured. Gilmore, Mary McGlynn's awesome Zara, Will Wheaton's Thorbia, but also some from the surrounding area, Cassandra, Allura, Dr. Dranzel. Now yes, in a campaign that went as long as theirs did, the character NPCs changed. That is true, but for the books you just have to choose a point in time for things like NPC stats. Maybe there is an NPC book planned, but some would have been very nice to have included. The real question though is if you are not a fan of Critical Role, should you buy this book? Let's be honest, if you're a fan of the show, you would have it already. Huge fans probably pre-ordered it. So the question is, if you don't watch the show, should you buy it? I would love to give a fully definitive answer here, but I think it is a little more nuanced than that. If you are a player only, then you could pass on this book, unless you love reading up on the lore in general, in which case you might really enjoy the cleverness of this setting. Now it gets a little trickier. Okay, let me ask you this. If you are a GM who firmly believes that the setting books are not to be messed with, that the Forgotten Realms is Forgotten Realms and Pathfinder is Pathfinder, and nothing that is not official will ever make its way into your game, then I would say pass on this book, unless you are going to set your campaign within Exandria. If you are a GM like myself, which causes endless hours of frustration for my players by changing all sorts of things, from monsters, or we have telepathic spiders, to locations, my D&D game has one strange-ass Sword Coast, Neverwinter, Baldur's Gate, then further south Sandpoint from Pathfinder, and eastwards Corvosa, also from Pathfinder. I play the rule of cool. Those places were too cool not to use and explore. If you are more like me and love expanding and playing with ideas, then I would say buy the book. The lore is interesting, but my players will be encountering the Ashari, the Clasp. They will travel to Emon, Whitestone, and the Shade Barrow, meet Gilmore and Zara. It's just too cool not to. It's a good book, and even though I am far from a super fan, I found worth in it. I hope there will be more to follow. So thanks for sitting through this quite possibly the longest RPG review I have ever done. Far longer than any of my Star Wars ones, and Star Wars is my thing. Enjoy your gaming. Be awesome to each other. And there is only one other thing. Is it Thursday yet?